Namaste, Dr. Chapple. Delighted to have you here. And I know that not only are you a scholar, but also a practitioner of Jain meditations. I'm so happy that you've been able to share your wisdom and your time with us. So, at the very outset, assuming that most people who are viewing you might have a frame of reference as yoga as meditation or Buddhist as meditation, could you help us understand how is Jain meditation similar to and different from either of these traditions?
It's very interesting because Jainism, the Jain faith, Jain practice goes back more than 2,800 years. It's older than Buddhism, and it's also recognized to have developed in a slightly different part of India, a little bit more to the eastern side of India than we generally associate with the Upanishads and the Vedas, which initially came more on the western side. And they probably arose, the early Upanishads and Jain insights into life, at roughly the same time. And whereas we find in Jainism very detailed discussions of samsara and the nature of the universe, as well as finding similar discussions in the Upanishads, with Jainism there are some remarkable distinctions and also many, many commonalities. But what I find particularly fascinating about the earliest literature, recorded written literature we have for Jainism, which comes out of the Acharanga Sutra, is the fascination with describing, first of all, our emplacement within the universe, within the four directions, and a very meticulous articulation of life in all of its various forms. And in Jainism, this insistence on the life force, the jiva, being present within not only the human, not only within animals, but even in the very particulate matter of earth and drops of water and rays of light and gusts of wind, that this exuberant celebration of living presence is unparalleled in human history, and it disposes oneself to a very active form of meditation that immediately translates into concern for ethical action.
It's interesting you brought up both of those words, which I was going to ask you next in terms of, yoga's emphasis on yamas, the ethical concepts, seem to be comparable, if not identical, to Jain, ethical concepts, if you will. So how do the two differ, do they? And where does meditation fit in the practice or contemplation of ethics?
It's very interesting because I've spent many decades reading the literature of meditation and yoga in Hindu, Mahabharata, Upanishads, Yoga Sutra, Sankhyakarika traditions, and in Buddhist early sutta literature and Abhidharma literature, and in Jain canonical and later medieval reflections. And they seem to have so much interplay and so much back and forth. And what we find with the Acharanga Sutra is the earliest detailed explication of what are called the five vratas, the 5 vows in Jainism, identical with the 5 yamas in yoga. And this is earlier than Patanjali. So it seems that that aspect was delineated first with the Jains and then borrowed in by Patanjali as part of his amalgamation of so many different Hindu, Buddhist, Jain yoga practices in the sutras. And then simultaneously, we see a later articulation of stages of spiritual progress, first found in Patanjali by the early centuries of the Common Era, the Eightfold Yoga, the Threefold Yoga, and then by the Yoga Bindu, which I just completed a translation of, we see a progressive yoga of 5 stages that has some parallels, and then a couple of centuries later, the Yoga Drishti Samuchaya aligns the Jain system of spiritual progress with the yoga system of Patanjali very, very directly. And in the meantime, a little bit of a catch up, there's a 14-fold spiritual path delineated in Jain tradition. So back and forth, ethics, stages of spiritual practice and progress, and the dialogue between these, as well as the dialogue with the Buddhists, is so vivid, so lively, and it's so helpful, as did Acharya Mahaprajna, to study these traditions in parallel, because there has never been a moment of, oh, this is the way that they have always done it, and this is exclusively one tradition or another. They've always been in robust conversation with one another.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because I was just, I think, sharing this with you that at a certain point in India, sometime, 500 before Common Era, or at that time frame, it is possible that many practices were occurring in different parts of India that may have gotten codified a little later, because it's reasonable to assume practices predate any attempt to codify it. In that context, you mentioned threefold or fivefold. So if we assume that yamas and niyamas, ethical values, were always integral for Jainism, what was the role of dhyana? Is dhyana one of the folds that you refer to as a part of Jainism? Is that something that came in later? Is that something that was always been there?
Well, in the earliest texts, and we know this even from the description of the vratyas in the Rig Veda, very interesting, because they seem to have been giving a report about these people that did something like yoga to the east of them before the word yoga was ever really part of the vocabulary relating to meditation. And what we see with this practice is the sustained attention of the mind produces particular states. And in the Yoga Sutra, we find they're referred to as vitarka, moving to vichara. In Buddhism, samprajñata, moving to asamprajñata. Within Jainism, they use the word dharana, and they use the word dhyana. And all of this sustained attention can result in a rather remarkable state of being whelmed, being totally absorbed, a state described as samadhi, an important term in each and every one of these traditions.
And as we've dialogued over the last few days, I know the concept of nature, and you're sitting there in a very idyllic situation. You have the colorful flowers behind you. You have, I think, Parshvanatha statue there. What is the significance of nature, environment, elements, and the human self?
Yeah, I like to think of this all as the interplay of the gocharas, the interplay, which are fields, with the senses and the elements. And when the Buddha gave forth his instructions to his very own son, he said, regard the earth, be patient like the earth. Regard the water, observe and absorb and remain unaffected by all of the troubles of the world. Observe the fire, be radiance in your presence within the world. Follow the breath, watch the breath, feel the breath, move like the breath moves without getting weighted down. And contemplate the vastness and the potential of space. These were the directions that the Buddha gave his very own son, and are the fundamental building blocks of what eventually evolved into, with the Satipatthana, awareness of the relationship between body, breath, feelings, and how they can be a gateway to broader Buddhist teachings. Similarly, when we look at the Garanda Samhita, one of my favorite more recent yoga texts, very specific instructions given on how to observe the earth, how to interface with water, fire, air, and space. And the linkages from very early on are seen between the senses and the elements in succession. So that in the Gyanarnava, a 9th, 10th century Jain meditation manual that becomes absorbed into the Yoga Shastra, a 10th, 11th century yoga meditation manual created by this great scholar called Hemachandra at the court in Patan in Gujarat, says two things. One, it says, reflect on the fragrance arising from the earth, the flavors received with water, the form illuminated by light, the feeling brought by the touch and the caress of the wind upon the skin, and the sound, the vibrations received by the ear and generated by the voice. All of these are tools to be employed in the service of bringing the mind to a place of clarity, bringing the mind to a place of alert, calm.
It's really interesting you bring up the sense organs here. Of course, in yoga, the parallel of pratyahara, the withdrawal. Yes. And it's interesting to hear the emphasis on savoring and delighting in the experience. But at the same time, it begs the question then, at what point do you not immerse, lose yourself in it, but you kind of have a slight separation, if you will, a witness, if you will, of that senses. And I know you are planning on a meditation practice today. I don't want to derail you with that question, but that was my thought, the emphasis and the sensory experience, aesthetics of it.
Yeah, the British did India a little bit of a disservice in 1862 when they passed a law mandating that the true religion in India was the religion of denial. And they came down on the side of a way of viewing the world that denies the world. And there's a whole variety of speculative thoughts about why they did this. But by doing so, they really tried to cut off even the political power of the bhakti movements, which certainly celebrate with puja. They tried to cut off many of the ideas such as put forth by Abhinavagupta, deeply valuing ethics in relationship to aesthetics. That you can't be only a good person, you have to be a beautiful person. You can't just be grim and withdrawn. You have to be able to embrace, you have to be able to totally understand yourself in order to find and peel away the levels and the layers to get to that highest self. So it's an intriguing question. And I've trained in yoga for some 5 decades. And I remember studying with a woman from Calcutta, and she said, it's through the senses that we find ourselves. It's not by denying the senses.
It's a beautiful explanation. I know we're going to be meeting for a few more sessions, so I'll save my other questions for the other sessions that we have. Please tell us a little bit about the practice that you want to share with us today.
Okay, the practice that I'd like to share is an elemental practice that engages the substratum of the meditator's predispositions and inclinations, and I'll even hazard to say difficulties. And we know from the Ishopanishad that it's only by hazarding what we don't want to look at that we're able to gain a sense of what must be looked at, and find the means in order to bring that into awareness so that we can put things in perspective, so that we can come to see that, oh, have a bit of an epiphany or a bit of a samadhi moment that I thought I was all about that. No, that's not who I am. So what we're going to do is from the Yoga Shastra, which I've already mentioned of Hemachandra, also from the Gyanarnava of Shubhachandra, and it's a very Jain reinterpretation of standard tantric, mantric, Shaiva practice. And it becomes transformed in a rather unique way. I'm going to explain the pieces of it, and then I'll ask people to sit with me as we visualize a little bit and as we reconceptualize our relationship with self. So in the very beginning, there's a correlative thinking about difficulty, such that difficulty is seen as dust, dirt, stuff of the earth. And each of us in our personality substructure has that little bit of thing that we don't like about ourselves, okay? In my case, it could be, oh no, look at all this white coming in. Or, you know, everybody has something, oh, my hands, they're beginning to look so old. Or it could be, you know, I'm just so good, I'm so proud. You know, that really makes me obnoxious. And I really wish I were slightly less obnoxious because I annoy people. So to take whatever that klesha, whatever that samskaravasana, karmic residue may be, and name it, I guess we should point to the heart, but just sort of go into that place of feeling tone and then regard it as a material presence. Regard it as a little bit of lump of mud or clay or even a dust mote. And the text says, visualize this as the lower part of a lotus. And then there's a pranayama exercise that we'll do in a couple of minutes. And in between, we're going to have a little bit of fire and a little bit of water. So take that moment of difficulty, and then with closed eyes, visualize that bit of dust mote, that collection of karmas, and then invite in the power of fire. And visualize in your mind's eye if perhaps you've seen a barn on fire, perhaps you've seen fire in the campground, perhaps fire within the fireplace at home. And then imagine tossing that little difficulty into that fire. And see it literally go up in flames. And then sit up tall. And we're going to invoke Bastrika. We're going to do 30 forceful exhales using the power of wind to generate an internal bodily fire. Now take your hands and bring them up to your nose and your face and feel perhaps even you've generated a little bit of heat on your forehead. And then visualize once more that that breath has raised up into the sky thunderclouds. And then feel either the power of your perspiration or your imagined return of purifying rain, thunderstorm, monsoon storm, and just imagine the waters pouring from the heavens, dousing out the fire, washing away the ashes of your incinerated karmas. And then take and reflect on a moment for just one moment. That your heart is like the heart of this symbolic figure of our freedom. The Jain Tirthankara Parshvanath, in his moment of liberation, brought all of those energies into the place of the heart, abiding from that point forward forevermore with karuna, with compassion for all living beings. It's that space of purified intention that allows us to be of service, that allows us to lift up and embrace what needs to be done within the world. And by developing a rhythm of acknowledging difficulty, imagining its incineration, breathing in such a way that purification happens through both the metaphor and the reality of cleansing water, that we're able, as it says in the Upanishads, to peel away the layers of the onion and dwell in a heart open and receptive to life in all of its forms. Able to live fully a life of nonviolence for inner peace and the peace of others. So, thank you.